In this video, we are going to be breaking down of SpongeBob Christmas lore, not as a celebration, but as something quieter and lonelier. Let's get started with the myth of collective joy. You remember how Christmas looks in Bikini Bottom? The lights are everywhere. The music never stops. The decorations feel loud, almost aggressive, like they are trying too hard to be noticed. On the surface, it looks warm. It looks safe. It looks like one of those Saturday morning cartoon memories that feels soft around the edges, like a VHS tape left playing in the background while you half slept on the couch. But when you slow down and actually sit with it, something feels off. The joy is visible everywhere, but it isn't shared. It's displayed. This version of Christmas isn't something the characters feel together. It's something they perform. The cheer works more like a uniform than an emotion. You don't opt into it. You wear it. And if you don't wear it correctly, if your smile is late or your tone is wrong, the system notices. This is where the loneliness starts. Not in silence, but in noise. Not in darkness, but under flashing lights. Bikini Bottom treats Christmas like a requirement. Decorations become proof of compliance. Songs become a test. Laughter becomes a signal that you are functioning the way you're supposed to. This isn't warmth. It's pressure. The kind of pressure that feels familiar if you've ever sat through a forced office holiday party while already burned out, already exhausted, already emotionally checked out. You're there, but you're not there. And everyone assumes that because you showed up, you must be fine. Either Christmas is a shared emotional experience, or it is a coordinated performance designed to hide emotional absence. Both cannot exist in the same reality, and Bikini Bottom quietly chooses the second option. The environment is dressed up to look alive, so no one has to ask how anyone actually feels inside it. This creates a strange paradox. The brighter the town becomes, the more isolated each character feels within it. You can sense the cognitive dissonance in the air. Everyone agrees that this is supposed to be the happiest time of the year, yet no one pauses long enough to confirm whether that happiness is real. The expectation replaces the feeling. The ritual replaces connection, and slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, joy turns into an obligation. This is where institutional loneliness thrives. Not because people are alone, but because togetherness has been reduced to a checklist. This kind of loneliness feels different. It doesn't come from being forgotten. It comes from being surrounded. You're part of the group, but only on the surface. Underneath, there's a quiet displacement happening. Your real emotional state gets pushed aside so the holiday can keep moving forward. This isn't neglect by accident. It's negligence by design. The system works better when no one slows it down with honesty. You probably recognize this feeling. The holiday that looks perfect on the outside but feels hollow once you're inside it. The sense that something important is missing, even though everything is technically in place. That's why this hits like a core memory and a fever dream at the same time. It's familiar, but unsettling. Yet clear. And when joy is mandatory, someone always ends up pretending. And more often than not, that someone is SpongeBob. You've always known SpongeBob as the loudest voice in the room during Christmas. The singing starts early. The decorations go up fast. The gifts are excessive, carefully wrapped, emotionally loaded. But when you slow it down, when you watch it the way you watch things as an adult, his cheer doesn't feel spontaneous. It feels rehearsed, like a routine he's practiced so many times that it runs on instinct. This isn't joy bubbling up. It's joy being generated on command. SpongeBob doesn't just celebrate Christmas. He manages it. He treats the holiday like a fragile system that could collapse if he doesn't keep feeding it energy. Every song is a reinforcement. Every smile is a maintenance check. Every overly excited gesture is him making sure the emotional temperature of the room doesn't drop. This is emotional labor, even if the show never calls it that. He's working to stabilize other people's moods before they even realize they're unstable. You've felt this before. Being the person who shows up early, stays late, fills the silence, keeps things upbeat because you're afraid of what happens if you stop. The optimism isn't fake, but it's strained. It's carrying more weight than it should. SpongeBob's happiness becomes a coping mechanism, a way to prevent emotional collapse in the people around him. Not because they asked him to, but because he senses how fragile everything really is. There's a quiet trauma underneath this behavior. SpongeBob has learned over time that connection feels conditional, that attention comes easier when he performs happiness well. So he overperforms it. Louder laughs, bigger smiles, more decorations. This isn't immaturity, it's adaptation. When a system rewards positivity and ignores discomfort, the safest option is to become relentlessly positive, even if it costs you. Sometimes happiness isn't a feeling, it's a job, and SpongeBob clocks in early. He treats Christmas like a shift that can't be missed. If he rests, if he slows down, if he lets the energy dip, something bad might happen. Maybe the room goes quiet. Maybe the loneliness becomes visible. So he keeps going. This is survival disguised as cheer. Either SpongeBob is naturally overflowing with endless joy, or he has learned that joy is the price of belonging. Both cannot be true at the same time, and the longer you watch, the more the second option settles in. His effort feels less like celebration and more like prevention. He's trying to stop something. Silence, rejection, emotional drift. There's cognitive dissonance in how this is framed. Everyone benefits from his energy, but no one asks how sustainable it is. His exhaustion is invisible because it's wrapped in brightness. This is how emotional overperformers disappear in plain sight. They look fine. They sound fine. They function perfectly until they don't. This is why SpongeBob feels so familiar to you now, in a way he didn't when you were a kid. As an adult, you recognize the burnout hiding inside the cheer, the way effort tries to replace safety, the way enthusiasm becomes a shield. It's comforting, but it's also lonely, because when you're the one holding everything together, there's no one left to hold you. And quietly, beneath the decorations and the music, SpongeBob keeps smiling, hoping that if he tries hard enough, the connection will finally feel real, because the alternative is realizing how the town actually works. Bikini Bottom runs on a silent contract. No one ever explains it. No one ever signs it. But everyone knows the terms. When Christmas arrives, participation is assumed. Celebration is not a choice. It is a requirement. You don't get asked how you feel about it. You get measured by how well you perform it. This is how the system maintains itself, not through force, but through expectation. The rule is simple. Celebrate, or be marked as something is wrong with you. Neutrality becomes suspicious. Silence feels like resistance. Even slowing down feels like failure. During Christmas, emotional neutrality is treated like a defect. If you're not visibly cheerful, the town doesn't lean in with concern. It leans back with judgment. This is how coercion works when it's disguised as tradition. What makes this contract so effective is that no one enforces it directly. There is no authority figure demanding smiles, no rule book spelling out consequences. Instead, compliance is social. Everyone watches everyone else. Decorations go up, so you put yours up. Songs play, so you sing along. Not because you want to, but because not doing so would make you stand out. And standing out during a holiday is dangerous. It invites questions you don't have the energy to answer. You've lived inside this before. The holiday where you felt tired, distant, or numb, but still showed up smiling, because it was easier than explaining yourself. The moment you realized that opting out would cost more socially than pretending. This is not warmth. This is pressure dressed up as cheer. It creates a shared surface experience while isolating everyone underneath it. Either this town is unified by genuine shared joy, or it is unified by fear of being the odd one out. Both cannot exist at the same time, and when you watch closely, the unity feels thin. It feels performative. Everyone is together, but separately. Each character trapped inside their own version of compliance, hoping not to draw attention to the cracks. This is where cognitive dissonance settles in. Christmas is supposed to be about togetherness, yet no one feels safe enough to be honest. The system rewards emotional conformity, not emotional truth. So people adapt. They smile when they're tired. They sing when they'd rather be quiet. They decorate even when it feels empty. This isn't joy spreading. It's silence being maintained. The town looks alive, but it feels hollow. The lights distract from the absence of real connection. The music fills space so no one notices the lack of conversation that matters. This is institutional loneliness at work. You are surrounded, included, accounted for, yet completely alone inside your own experience. And the more perfectly you comply, the less visible your isolation becomes. What makes this especially unsettling is how normal it feels. The contract isn't new. It repeats every year. It becomes familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. You know the role. You know the expectations. You know how to get through it. That familiarity is what turns pressure into routine. This is how a system stops feeling cruel and starts feeling inevitable. No one asked if they wanted to celebrate. They were simply expected to. And the decorations were there to make sure no one questioned that expectation for too long. Look closely at Bikini Bottom during Christmas. The lights don't just glow, they overwhelm. Every surface is covered. Every empty space is filled. Wreaths hang where nothing needs to be hung. Ribbons wrap things that were fine before. Even the sand looks different, dusted and styled to resemble snow, like the town itself is pretending to be somewhere else. This isn't decoration as expression, it's decoration as distraction. The more color you add, the less room there is to notice what's missing. Brightness becomes camouflage. It pulls your attention outward so you don't sit with what's happening inside. This is why the decorations feel so aggressive when you watch them as an adult. They aren't subtle. They don't invite reflection. They dominate the environment. They make stillness uncomfortable, and stillness is dangerous because stillness is where feelings surface. This is not warmth, it's insulation, the kind you use to cover a draft instead of fixing the window. The town wraps itself in lights the way someone wraps themselves in noise when they don't want to think. The visual stimulation keeps everything moving. Your eyes stay busy. Your mind stays occupied. There's no space left to ask how anyone is actually doing. You've felt this in real life. The office decorated to the point of exhaustion. The playlist looping endlessly so no one has to talk. The forced cheer that fills the room like artificial heat. It looks comforting, but it doesn't actually warm you. It just prevents you from noticing how cold you already feel. This is emotional displacement. Instead of connection, you get decoration. Either these decorations are enhancing a shared emotional experience, or they are replacing one that isn't there. Both cannot be true. And when you strip the lights away in your mind, when you imagine the room without the color, what's left feels quiet, too quiet. That's why the decorations stay up. They are doing emotional work the people aren't equipped to do. The town doesn't use decorations to express joy. It uses them to suppress discomfort. Every strand of lights becomes a barrier against silence. Every ornament becomes a reason not to talk. When the environment is loud enough, no one has to ask difficult questions. No one has to admit they feel lonely in a room full of people. This is how loneliness survives undetected. It hides behind spectacle. There's something deeply lulling about this too. The repetition, the glow, the sameness of it all. It turns the town into a liminal space, suspended between genuine celebration and emotional absence. You can drift here. You can stop paying attention. That's part of the design. The decorations don't just distract from loneliness. They soothe you into accepting it. This is why the holidays can feel like a fever dream. Everything looks exaggerated, unreal, slightly too perfect, like a memory that's been polished too many times. You remember the look, but not the feeling. The colors remain, the connection fades, and somehow that's considered success. The brighter Bikini Bottom becomes, the less anyone has to speak. The silence doesn't disappear. It just gets covered, layer by layer, light by light, until it's still there, untouched, waiting underneath it all. Color fills the room so silence doesn't have to. But even covered silence has weight, and eventually that weight starts to show in small, quiet ways. This is where the holiday narrative begins to thin. Not break, not collapse, just stretch enough for you to notice that something isn't lining up for everyone. Christmas is happening all around Bikini Bottom, but it isn't happening to everyone in the same way. Some characters move through the season like shadows, present but not included, accounted for but not acknowledged. The celebration keeps moving, and they move with it, quietly, without friction, without attention. You start to notice how easy it is to miss them. When the music is loud and the lights are bright, absence doesn't register. Someone can be standing right there and still feel invisible. This is the first fracture, the moment where togetherness becomes selective. The holiday assumes uniform impact, but reality doesn't cooperate. Some people drift, not away from the town, but away from the emotional center of it. This drifting isn't dramatic. That's what makes it unsettling. There's no argument, no refusal, no visible breakdown, just a gradual slipping into the background. You see it in the way certain characters linger at the edge of scenes, the way their reactions are delayed, muted, or skipped entirely. They are participating, technically, but emotionally, they're elsewhere. This is what institutional loneliness looks like when it's functioning properly. No alarms, no disruptions, just quiet disengagement. You've been here before, sitting in a room full of people during the holidays, feeling oddly detached, like you're watching everything through glass. You laugh when it's appropriate. You nod when expected. But inside, you're somewhere else entirely. This isn't sadness in the traditional sense. It's displacement. Your body is present, but your emotional self has stepped aside to avoid being overwhelmed. Either Christmas is universally comforting, or it reveals the differences in how people experience connection. Both cannot be true, and Bikini Bottom chooses not to look too closely at that contradiction. The system depends on the assumption that the holiday works the same way for everyone. Acknowledging fractures would require slowing down. It would require listening. It would require space. So instead, the narrative stays smooth, even as it quietly leaves people behind. What's striking is how no one means to cause this. There's no villain here, no deliberate neglect, just a system optimized for surface harmony. When harmony is measured by appearances, anyone who doesn't match the expected emotional tone becomes harder to see. Not because they disappear, but because the framework has no place for them. They don't fit the story being told. This is where joy becomes visible, and loneliness becomes invisible. The town celebrates what it can see. Smiles, decorations, participation. What it can't see, it doesn't count. Internal experiences get erased. Emotional complexity gets flattened, and the holiday moves forward, satisfied with its own reflection. The fracture doesn't announce itself. It hums softly in the background. It feels like being present without being held, included without being known. This is why the narrative remains comforting on the surface. Nothing is wrong enough to stop it. Nothing is loud enough to demand attention. Everything is just quiet enough to continue. And this quiet continuation is what makes the loneliness feel so deep. Not sharp, not urgent, just steady, predictable, familiar, the kind of feeling that settles in and stays because nothing ever challenges it. This is where the story stops being about celebration and starts being about who the celebration overlooks. And this is where the story quietly begins to split, because once the fractures exist, someone inevitably gets blamed for noticing them, and that someone is Squidward. Squidward does not celebrate Christmas the way the town expects him to, and that alone is treated as a problem, not a preference, not a boundary, a defect. His quiet, his irritation, his refusal to participate with enthusiasm are immediately interpreted as bitterness. The town doesn't pause to ask why he feels this way. It skips straight to diagnosis. Something must be wrong with him. This is how non-joy becomes pathologized. When Squidward opts out, he isn't attacking the holiday. He's protecting himself from it. His withdrawal isn't cruelty. It's conservation. Christmas in Bikini Bottom demands emotional output, and Squidward simply doesn't have it to give. That doesn't make him broken. It makes him honest. But honesty is uncomfortable in systems that rely on performance. So the system reframes honesty as hostility. You've seen this happen in real life. The coworker who doesn't smile through the holiday party. The family member who sits quietly while everyone else performs cheer. Instead of asking what they need, the group labels them difficult, negative, toxic. This is emotional gaslighting at its softest setting. The message is subtle but clear. If you don't feel what we feel, you are the problem. Squidward's silence becomes evidence against him. His lack of enthusiasm is treated like a moral failure. The town reads his boundaries as an attack on collective joy. This is the paradox. He isn't refusing connection, he's refusing coercion. And those two things look identical to people who only recognize connection when it's loud. Either Squidward is genuinely malicious toward happiness, or he is responding rationally to an environment that exhausts him. Both cannot exist in the same reality. And when you look closely, his behavior feels measured, not cruel. He doesn't sabotage Christmas. He simply steps back from it. The offense is not what he does, it's what he refuses to perform. There's a deep fatigue underneath his posture, not anger, not resentment, just tiredness. Squidward has learned that participating costs him more than it gives back. The noise, the forced cheer, the constant demand to react correctly. Opting out becomes an act of self-preservation. But the system has no language for that. It only understands participation or rejection. This is how emotional boundaries get mislabeled as personality flaws. Squidward isn't allowed to be neutral. Neutrality threatens the illusion of universal joy. If one person doesn't feel it, the myth starts to crack, so the town closes ranks. It tells itself a simpler story. Squidward hates Christmas. Squidward hates fun. Squidward is the issue. That way, nothing else has to change. You might recognize this from your own life. The moment you stop pretending to enjoy something that drains you, and suddenly you're seen as difficult, as if opting out is an act of aggression. This creates cognitive dissonance. You know you're protecting yourself, but the world responds like you've done something wrong. Squidward carries that dissonance quietly. He doesn't argue, he doesn't explain. He withdraws further, and every step back becomes proof that the label was correct. This is how isolation compounds. The less you perform, the more you're judged. The more you're judged, the less safe it feels to engage. When someone doesn't perform happiness, we assume something is wrong with them. And once that assumption settles in, everything they do gets filtered through it. Squidward is never invisible in Bikini Bottom. He is always there. His house sits in the center of everything. His voice carries. His presence is unavoidable. And yet he is never actually heard. The town sees him constantly, but it never listens to him. This is a specific kind of loneliness. the kind that grows when people think they already understand you well enough to stop paying attention. Everyone has a version of Squidward in their head, the grump, the downer, the one who ruins the mood. Once that story is established, nothing he says can escape it. His words don't land as information. They land as confirmation. If he complains, it proves the label. If he stays quiet, it proves the label. Even when he does nothing, the town fills in the meaning for him. This is how being seen turns into being erased. You've felt this before. Being surrounded by people who know your name, your role, your reputation, but not your inner life. They know how you're supposed to react, so they stop asking how you actually feel. This is not neglect in the obvious sense. It's a quieter negligence, one that comes from assumption instead of malice, and that makes it harder to call out. Squidward's loneliness deepens because it happens in plain sight. He isn't isolated on the edge of town. He's right there in the middle of everything. That's what makes it hurt differently. When you're alone and unseen, you can at least tell yourself no one knows. But when you're constantly observed and still misunderstood, the loneliness feels heavier. It feels personal, even if it isn't. The town believes it understands Squidward, and that belief replaces empathy. Why ask questions when you already have answers? Why listen when you've already decided what he represents? This is where cognitive dissonance settles in. Squidward knows he is more complex than the role assigned to him, but every interaction reinforces the opposite. Over time, it teaches him that speaking up won't change anything. This is the paradox of being surrounded. The more people around you who think they know you, the harder it becomes to be known. Squidward's interior life becomes invisible precisely because his exterior is so familiar. He becomes background noise in his own existence, a fixture, a constant, someone who is always present but never truly engaged with. You might recognize this from adulthood, the workplace where everyone knows your job title, but not your stress. The family gathering where everyone assumes you're fine because you always are. The way familiarity breeds emotional distance instead of closeness. This is not a lack of attention. It's a misdirection of it. Either Squidward is fully understood by the town, or he has been reduced to a caricature that's easier to manage than the truth. Both cannot exist at the same time, and the longer this goes on, the clearer it becomes that understanding has been replaced by convenience. It's easier to label than to listen, easier to assume than to engage. So Squidward stops trying to correct the narrative, not because he agrees with it, but because resistance costs too much. Every attempt to be heard feels like shouting into a room that has already decided what it wants to hear. This is where loneliness stops being about isolation and starts being about futility. Being noticed is not the same as being known, and Christmas is the moment when that misunderstanding turns into an evaluation. In Bikini Bottom, Christmas doesn't arrive as a celebration. It arrives as an audit, a quiet one, an unspoken one. No clipboards, no formal criteria, just a collective sense that everyone is being observed a little more closely than usual. Who is smiling enough? Who is participating correctly? Who looks like they belong in the story being told? This is when emotion becomes performance data. The holiday magnifies everything. Small reactions feel bigger. Neutral expressions feel suspicious. Silence feels like a failure to comply. During the rest of the year, you might be allowed to drift. During Christmas, drifting gets noticed. This is when deviation becomes visible, and visibility turns into judgment, not loudly, calmly, casually, as if it's obvious. Squidward doesn't fail Christmas by doing something wrong. He fails it by not doing enough. Not smiling at the right moments, not reacting with the expected enthusiasm, not matching the emotional tempo of the room. His refusal to perform joy becomes evidence against him, not proof of his feelings, but proof of his alleged deficiency. This is how audits work. The absence of data is treated as negative data. You've lived through this, the season where everyone asks how you're doing, but not because they want the answer. They're checking for alignment. They're listening for the right tone. They're watching your face. If your response doesn't match the expectation, it creates discomfort, and that discomfort gets projected back onto you. Suddenly, you're the problem for not fitting the mood. Christmas in Bikini Bottom operates the same way. It doesn't ask what you need. It checks whether you're functioning, whether you're festive enough, whether you're helping maintain the atmosphere. This is emotional conformity disguised as tradition. The rules aren't written down, but they're enforced socially. A smile here, a song there. Participation becomes currency. Either Christmas is about warmth and connection, or it is about monitoring emotional output to preserve a shared illusion. Both cannot exist at the same time, and when you watch how the town reacts to Squidward, the illusion starts to show cracks. No one pulls him aside to ask what's wrong. They simply log his behavior as a failure to comply. The tone of this audit is what makes it unsettling. There's no anger in it, no confrontation, just a quiet tallying, a sense that everyone knows who passed and who didn't. This creates a low-level anxiety that hums beneath the lights and music. You're not being punished directly. You're being categorized, and once categorized, your experience stops mattering. This is where cognitive dissonance deepens. The holiday claims to be about kindness, yet it leaves no room for emotional variance. It celebrates inclusion while quietly excluding anyone who doesn't match the emotional template. Squidward becomes a case study, a reference point, proof that the system works. He didn't pass, so everyone else must be doing fine. You can feel how exhausting this is. The constant self-monitoring, the awareness that every reaction is being measured, even if no one admits it. This is why holidays drain people, not because they're busy, but because they're evaluative. You're not just present, you're being assessed, and assessment kills rest. Squidward senses this instinctively. He knows that nothing he offers will be enough, so he stops offering. This, of course, becomes another mark against him. The audit doesn't account for burnout. It doesn't recognize withdrawal as self-preservation. It only knows compliance or failure, and that binary keeps the system clean. Some seasons don't ask how you're doing. They measure it. And when someone fails that measurement, SpongeBob steps in, not as an enforcer, but as a fixer. SpongeBob sees Squidward's discomfort and responds the only way he knows how. He tries to cheer him up. Louder songs, bigger gestures, more effort. On the surface, this looks like kindness, and it is kindness in intention. But intention isn't the same as understanding. SpongeBob doesn't pause to listen to what Squidward is actually expressing. He assumes the problem is a lack of joy, not a boundary being crossed. This is where empathy slips into projection. SpongeBob experiences happiness as something universal. In his world, joy is transferable. If he feels it strongly enough, surely it will spread. Surely it will fix things. So when Squidward doesn't respond, SpongeBob doesn't adjust his approach. He escalates it. More cheer, more energy, more insistence. The help becomes louder instead of deeper. You've been on both sides of this, trying to help someone by offering what works for you instead of what they're asking for, or being on the receiving end, smiling politely while feeling increasingly unseen. This is what happens when empathy skips the listening phase. The gesture is sincere, but it lands wrong. And because it's well-intentioned, it becomes harder to refuse. SpongeBob never asks Squidward what he needs. He assumes the answer is joy because joy is always the answer for him. This creates a subtle form of pressure, not aggressive, not cruel, just constant. The message underneath is simple. If you would just feel differently, everything would be fine. That message doesn't sound harmful, but it carries weight. It places responsibility for the discomfort entirely on Squidward. Either Squidward's feelings are valid as they are, or they are a problem to be solved by someone else's optimism. Both cannot exist at the same time, and SpongeBob, without realizing it, chooses the second option. His kindness turns into a quiet refusal to accept Squidward's reality, not because he wants to dismiss it, but because he doesn't know how to sit with it. This is where cognitive dissonance creeps in. SpongeBob believes he is helping. Squidward feels increasingly cornered. The more SpongeBob tries, the more Squidward withdraws, and that withdrawal gets interpreted as further evidence that something is wrong. The cycle feeds itself. Help becomes pressure. Pressure becomes resistance. Resistance becomes justification for even more help. What makes this dynamic so uncomfortable is how familiar it feels in adulthood. The workplace wellness initiative that ignores your actual workload. The friend who insists you just need to think positive. The holiday gathering where someone won't stop asking why you're so quiet. None of it is meant to hurt you, but it still does, because it doesn't leave room for who you actually are in that moment. SpongeBob's empathy is real, but it's incomplete. It's empathy without consent. He never considers that Squidward might not want to be cheered up, that maybe the most supportive thing would be to leave him alone. Silence, in this context, would be respect, but silence feels like failure to SpongeBob. So, he keeps filling the space. This is how good intentions quietly become overwhelming, not through malice but through persistence, not through cruelty but through refusal to adjust. SpongeBob wants to fix the discomfort because discomfort scares him, and Squidward becomes the place where that fear gets acted out. Good intentions don't always feel good on the receiving end, and when those intentions repeat without adjustment, the effect doesn't explode, it settles. Nothing dramatic happens to Squidward. There is no single argument, no final straw, no clear moment where everything breaks. Instead, something quieter takes shape. Each ignored boundary adds a little distance. Each forced smile directed at him adds another layer of separation. The loneliness doesn't arrive. It accumulates, like dust in a room no one checks anymore. This is what makes it so easy to miss. Squidward is still there, still visible, still functioning. He shows up. He speaks when spoken to. He occupies space, but the care never follows the attention. Visibility without care becomes its own form of neglect. People see him, but they don't hold him. And over time, that absence does more damage than open rejection ever could. The town keeps offering cheer the same way, over and over, as if repetition will eventually work. And every time it doesn't, the response is not reflection. It's persistence. This creates a quiet kind of invalidation. Squidward's feelings aren't argued with. They're bypassed, treated as something to get past, not something to understand. This teaches him that honesty doesn't change outcomes. It only prolongs discomfort. You felt this pattern before. The moment you realize that explaining yourself costs more energy than staying silent, that setting boundaries just invites more pressure. So you stop explaining. You nod. You disengage. Not because you're fine, but because resistance feels pointless. This is how isolation hardens, not suddenly, but steadily. Joy without consent becomes a burden. It turns every interaction into a reminder that your internal state is inconvenient. Squidward learns that the safest position is emotional distance. If he doesn't expect understanding, he can't be disappointed by its absence. This isn't bitterness. It's self-protection, a response to repeated emotional negligence. Either connection grows through listening, or it erodes through assumption. Both cannot exist together, and in Bikini Bottom, assumption wins by default. The town assumes it knows what Squidward needs. It assumes cheer is always the answer. It assumes persistence equals care. None of these assumptions are malicious, but they are effective at pushing him further away. The consequences show up slowly. Squidward speaks less, reacts less, expects less. His world gets smaller, not because he wants it to, but because it's easier to manage. The less he shares, the less there is to invalidate. The less he hopes, the less it hurts. This is how loneliness becomes stable, predictable, familiar. There's something almost soothing about this stage. The conflict fades. The pressure dulls. What remains is a quiet resignation. This is why nothing looks wrong from the outside. The system sees compliance. What it doesn't see is the cost, the internal withdrawal, the emotional dimming, the way a person can still function while slowly disappearing from themselves. As a viewer, this is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable in a gentle way, because you recognize it, the way loneliness doesn't announce itself, the way it settles into routines, the way it becomes part of the background noise of adult life, especially during the holidays when everything insists you should feel something else. Squidward doesn't collapse under forced cheer. He adapts to it, and adaptation is quieter than failure. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't disrupt the system. It just removes a piece of humanity, one small piece at a time, until what's left feels manageable, but empty. Nothing broke all at once. It just never healed, and that slow damage hardens into a rule the town never says out loud, but always follows. In Bikini Bottom, Christmas operates on a binary that feels calm, logical, and absolute. You either love it or you are the problem. There is no middle space, no neutral ground. Celebration equals goodness. Resistance equals defect. This rule is never announced, but everyone understands it. The system runs smoothly because it doesn't need to explain itself. It only needs people to fall in line. Once you see this binary, you start noticing how rigid it is. There are only two roles available: the cheerful participant or the disruptive outsider. If you smile, you belong. If you hesitate, you raise concern. The holiday doesn't allow ambiguity. It doesn't make room for mixed feelings. You are either contributing to the atmosphere or threatening it. And the moment you're seen as a threat, even a quiet one, the story has already decided who you are. This logic feels familiar if you've lived through adult holidays. The subtle pressure to declare your enjoyment, the way disinterest gets interpreted as negativity, the assumption that if you don't love this, something must be wrong with you. This is not emotional warmth. It's moral sorting. The holiday becomes a test of character rather than a moment of connection. Squidward doesn't fit neatly into either category, and that's the problem. He doesn't sabotage Christmas. He doesn't campaign against it. He simply doesn't love it. And in a binary system, that's enough to fail. Neutrality doesn't exist here. Silence gets read as rejection. Withdrawal gets labeled as hostility. The absence of enthusiasm becomes proof of deficiency. Either Christmas is optional or it is mandatory. Both cannot be true at the same time, and Bikini Bottom treats it as mandatory while pretending it's voluntary. That contradiction creates cognitive dissonance for anyone who doesn't feel the joy they're supposed to feel. You're told this is about choice, but punished when you choose differently. The system stays clean by pretending the rules don't exist. What makes this binary so effective is how gentle it feels. There's no confrontation, no ultimatum spoken aloud, just a quiet understanding. If you don't love this, you are making things harder for everyone else. That pressure doesn't shout, it hums. And because it hums, it feels reasonable. It feels like common sense. You've probably internalized this without realizing it. The instinct to smile through discomfort, to reassure people you're fine so you don't become a problem. The way you downplay your own feelings to maintain group harmony. This is how the binary reproduces itself. People comply not because they believe in it, but because resisting it costs too much. The town doesn't need villains. It just needs contrast. Someone who fails the test so everyone else can pass. Squidward becomes that contrast. His existence helps define the rule. He shows what happens when you don't perform correctly, not through punishment, but through exclusion, through labeling, through quiet dismissal. Once the binary is in place, empathy becomes unnecessary. Why ask why someone feels the way they do when the answer is already sorted? They don't love Christmas, therefore they are the problem. This simplifies everything. It reduces emotional complexity into something manageable, something orderly, something that doesn't disrupt the celebration. This is why the system feels so stable. It doesn't bend. It doesn't listen. It doesn't adapt. It categorizes. And once categorized, there is nowhere to go. No role to step into that isn't already defined. You are either inside the warmth or outside it, inside the story or the reason it needs defending. In this system, there are only two choices, and one is already decided. Because binaries don't exist to tell the truth. They exist to make things easier to live with. Bikini Bottom relies on simple moral rules because complexity is exhausting. If joy is good and refusal is bad, then no one has to think too hard. No one has to slow down and ask uncomfortable questions. No one has to sit with someone else's pain without trying to fix it. The binary offers emotional efficiency. It turns something messy into something manageable. This is where moral simplification becomes a form of safety. When the world is reduced to clear categories, people can relax inside them. You know where you stand. You know what's expected. You know how to behave. Christmas becomes easier when it's reduced to a checklist. Smile, decorate, participate. If everyone follows the same script, there's less risk of disruption, less chance of silence, less chance of discomfort. The town isn't choosing cruelty. It's choosing rest. Emotional complexity requires effort. It requires listening, patience, and the willingness to accept that not everything can be resolved cleanly. Binaries remove that burden. They tell you who is right and who is wrong before the conversation even begins. This creates a sense of order that feels calming, especially during a season that already demands so much. You've felt this pull yourself, the relief that comes with simple explanations, the comfort of labeling something as good or bad instead of sitting with uncertainty. When you're tired, stressed, or burned out, complexity feels threatening. It asks more of you than you can give, so you gravitate towards stories that make sense quickly, stories that don't ask you to stay awake emotionally. Either Christmas is joyful or it is being ruined. Either people participate or they cause problems. Both cannot exist together. This logic allows the town to protect itself from emotional ambiguity. It doesn't have to acknowledge that joy and exhaustion can coexist, that celebration can hurt, that togetherness can feel isolating. Those truths complicate the narrative, so they get filtered out. This simplification doesn't just protect the group, it protects individuals within it. If you follow the rule, you don't have to examine your own feelings too closely. You don't have to wonder whether your cheer is genuine or just habitual. You can move through the holiday on autopilot. That autopilot feels safe, predictable, almost soothing. But there's a cost. Simplified moral systems create blind spots. Anyone who doesn't fit the binary becomes a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. Squidward isn't complex in this framework. He's just wrong. And because the system believes it already knows what he represents, it doesn't have to listen to him. Understanding would require effort. Labeling requires nothing. This is why the town chooses rest over understanding again and again. Understanding keeps you awake. It forces you to confront things that don't resolve neatly. Rest, even false rest, feels better, especially during the holidays, when everyone is already running low. The binary offers a kind of emotional sleep, a way to stop thinking. You can hear how gentle this process is. No one announces the rule. No one enforces it harshly. It simply settles in. People repeat it without noticing. Joy is good, resistance is bad. The story becomes familiar enough that it stops feeling like a choice. It feels like reality. This is why simple stories last. Not because they are true, but because they are comfortable. They create a world that is easy to navigate, even if it leaves people behind. The town can keep moving. The celebration can continue. And the complexity that might slow things down stays quietly outside the frame. Simple stories are easier to live inside, and once a story needs to stay simple, it also needs a character to carry everything that doesn't fit. In Bikini Bottom, that character is Squidward, not because he actively opposes Christmas, but because his discomfort gives the holiday its shape. Someone has to be unhappy, so everyone else can feel correctly happy. This is not personal, it is structural. Squidward becomes functional, a reference point, a reminder of what not to be. The town's moral narrative depends on contrast. Joy only feels meaningful when it has something to push against. Celebration only looks bright when something nearby looks dim. Squidward provides that contrast simply by existing without enthusiasm. He doesn't need to sabotage anything. His presence alone is enough to stabilize the story. If he is wrong, then everyone else must be right. This is how scapegoating works when it's quiet. No one openly blames him. They don't need to. His role is implied. He absorbs the tension so the rest of the group doesn't have to. Any discomfort people feel about forced cheer can be redirected toward him. If Christmas feels exhausting, it's not because the system is flawed. It's because Squidward is being difficult. That explanation keeps everything else intact. You've seen this pattern outside of cartoons. Every group has someone who carries the negativity so others don't have to question their own feelings. The one who doesn't smile enough. The one who sits out. The one who makes things awkward just by being honest. Their presence reassures everyone else that the problem is located, contained, and external. Squidward's unhappiness becomes useful. It gives the town emotional clarity. As long as he exists as the antagonist, the binary stays clean. Happy people are good. Unhappy people are the issue. There's no need to examine why the holiday feels heavy. No need to admit that joy might be conditional or draining. Squidward holds that complexity for everyone else, whether he agrees to or not. Either the holiday system is imperfect, or Squidward is. Both cannot be true at the same time. And it's far easier to believe in a flawed individual than a flawed tradition. Traditions feel sacred, people feel replaceable. So the system quietly sacrifices one person's emotional reality to preserve collective comfort. The tone of this exclusion is gentle, almost polite. Squidward isn't attacked. He's tolerated. He's allowed to exist as long as he stays in his role, as long as he remains the grump, the outsider, the necessary counterexample. This kind of exclusion doesn't look cruel. It looks reasonable. That's why it lasts. Over time, Squidward internalizes this position. He becomes more withdrawn, not because he wants to, but because he understands what is expected of him. If he tried to join in fully, the story would wobble. If he suddenly loved Christmas, the contrast would disappear. The system would lose its anchor. So he stays where he is, outside the warmth, but close enough to define it. This is the quiet tragedy of being assigned meaning you never consented to. Squidward's inner life stops mattering because his function matters more. He isn't a person in the narrative. He's a symbol, a cautionary tale, proof that the holiday works for everyone else. You might feel the familiarity of this if you've ever been the odd one out in a group that needed you to stay that way. The one whose discomfort made everyone else feel normal. The one whose silence filled a role. It's not dramatic, it's steady, and it's exhausting. The town doesn't celebrate Squidward's unhappiness, but it relies on it. His exclusion stabilizes the group. His distance preserves the illusion. And as long as someone is clearly wrong, everyone else gets to feel safely right. Someone has to be wrong, so everyone else can be right. And when Squidward stays into that position, something quiet begins to unravel for SpongeBob. SpongeBob has built his sense of self around the idea that joy spreads, that happiness is contagious, that if you show up with enough enthusiasm, enough warmth, enough effort, eventually everyone will feel it too. This belief isn't casual for him. It's foundational. His optimism isn't just a personality trait. It's how he understands the world and how he understands his place in it. So when Squidward doesn't change, when the cheer doesn't land, SpongeBob doesn't get angry. He gets confused. His usual tools stop working. The songs don't fix it. The decorations don't fix it. The extra effort doesn't fix it. And for the first time, the possibility creeps in that joy might not be universal, that it might not be transferable, that it might not be something you can hand to someone else, no matter how carefully you wrap it. This creates a crisis of meaning. If positivity doesn't work, what does that say about the role SpongeBob has been playing? He isn't just trying to make others happy. He's trying to confirm that his way of being is valid. When joy spreads, it proves that his optimism has purpose. When it doesn't, the certainty drains out of him, slowly, quietly, without drama. You can hear it in the way his energy shifts. He keeps smiling, but it's less confident. He keeps trying, but there's hesitation underneath it. The repetition softens. The rhythm changes. This isn't burnout yet. It's doubt. The moment where you realize that effort doesn't guarantee outcome, the caring doesn't always lead to connection. You felt this in your own life, being the one who keeps morale up at work, the one who smooths things over in relationships, the one who believes that if you just stay positive, everything will work out. And then one day, it doesn't. The positivity doesn't fix the tension. The encouragement doesn't change the mood. And instead of feeling angry, you feel unsure of who you're supposed to be now. SpongeBob doesn't have a backup identity. His optimism has always been his anchor. So when it fails to convert Squidward, the failure feels personal. Not because Squidward did anything wrong, but because SpongeBob doesn't know how to exist in a world where happiness isn't enough. This is where the system quietly harms him too. Either joy is powerful enough to solve discomfort, or some discomfort isn't meant to be solved. Both cannot be true. And SpongeBob stands in the gap between those ideas, unsure which one to accept. If he accepts the second, his role changes. He would have to learn to sit with sadness without fixing it, to allow distance without filling it. That kind of presence feels unfamiliar and frightening, so he hesitates. He tries again, but with less certainty. His optimism becomes thinner, stretched over confusion. The town still reads him as cheerful, but inside something has shifted. The binary that once felt safe now feels limiting. If happiness doesn't work on everyone, maybe the story he's been telling himself is incomplete. This uncertainty is gentle, but it's heavy. SpongeBob doesn't collapse. He doesn't lash out. He just slows down. He starts to feel the weight of being responsible for how everyone else feels. And that responsibility, once comforting, starts to feel unsustainable. This is why this moment resonates so deeply as an adult, because you recognize the feeling of optimism failing quietly, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow realization that positivity alone can't carry everything. That sometimes, no matter how hard you try, people stay where they are. SpongeBob stands in that realization, still smiling, but no longer certain why. And that uncertainty lingers, unanswered, hanging in the air. What happens when positivity doesn't work is not collapse, but consolidation. Because when uncertainty appears, the system doesn't change. It tightens. The binary remains. Joy is still treated as duty. Refusal is still read as failure. Nothing about the structure of Christmas in Bikini Bottom adjusts to accommodate doubt. Instead, the rules become quieter and more rigid at the same time. The expectation doesn't disappear. It settles deeper, like a habit no one remembers choosing. SpongeBob's uncertainty doesn't disrupt the system. Squidward's withdrawal doesn't disrupt it either. The town keeps moving forward exactly as it always has. Decorations stay up. Songs keep playing. Smiles continue to circulate. The surface remains smooth. That smoothness is the proof the system uses to justify itself. If everything looks fine, then everything must be fine. This is how the loop sustains itself. Joy is treated as a responsibility, not an emotion. If you carry it well, you're praised. If you struggle with it, you're corrected. And if you refuse it entirely, you become an example, not an exception. An example of what happens when someone doesn't cooperate with the story everyone else is trying to live inside. Squidward stays where he is, not because he can't move, but because movement would require the system to notice him differently. SpongeBob keeps trying, but with less confidence, because stopping would force him to confront the possibility that effort doesn't always lead to connection. Both of them adapt in ways that preserve the structure rather than challenge it. This is how isolation deepens without conflict. Either the system changes to meet people where they are, or people change themselves to survive the system. Both cannot happen at the same time, and Bikini Bottom chooses the second option, not consciously, but consistently. That choice keeps everything stable. It also keeps everyone alone in very specific ways. The cadence slows here, not because anything is resolved, but because nothing is. The repetition becomes familiar. Holiday arrives. Expectations rise. Performances begin. Discomfort gets labeled. Roles get reinforced. The same people end up carrying the same weight. The loop doesn't need a conclusion. It only needs continuity. You can feel how this becomes sleep-inducing. The predictability, the lack of surprise, the knowledge that nothing sudden is coming. This is the comfort of systems, even when they're flawed. They tell you what will happen next. They remove uncertainty. They trade understanding for routine. And routine, even empty routine, can feel soothing when you're tired. This is why the story doesn't offer answers here. Answers would require change. Change would require energy. And the entire town, in its own quiet way, is conserving energy. It chooses repetition over reflection, familiar discomfort over unfamiliar truth. That choice keeps the holiday intact year after year. The loop closes gently. Joy remains visible. Loneliness remains invisible. The binary remains unquestioned. Those who fit stay inside the warmth. Those who don't stay just outside of it, close enough to be seen, far enough to be untouched. Nothing breaks, nothing heals. Everything simply continues. And as the cadence slows and the narrative settles into itself, the system hums along exactly as designed. Calm, orderly, unexamined. The kind of structure that doesn't ask you to stay awake, only to keep going. And so the pattern continues, uninterrupted, until the noise finally runs out and Christmas night arrives. Not as a celebration, but as an aftermath. This is the moment when the decorations stop working. The lights are still on, but they no longer feel bright. The music fades, not abruptly, but naturally, like something losing momentum. The streets of Bikini Bottom empty out. Doors close. Voices disappear behind walls. And one by one, the characters return to themselves, without an audience watching, without a role to perform. Christmas night is not a climax here. It's a residue, what's left after the performance ends. All day, the town was busy sustaining the illusion, smiling, singing, participating. But now there's no one left to impress, no one left to reassure. And in that quiet, something becomes clearer. The holiday didn't fix anything. It didn't resolve the loneliness. It only delayed it. You can feel the shift immediately. The stillness stretches. Without the music, there's space to notice how tired everyone is. Without the lights demanding attention, the emptiness underneath becomes visible. This is the part no one talks about. The emotional drop that comes when a major event passes and you're left alone with yourself again. This is familiar. The drive home after a holiday gathering. The quiet house once the guests leave. The moment you sit down and realize how heavy your body feels. During the celebration, the momentum carried you. Now there's nothing to distract you. This is when feelings you didn't have time for finally show up. In Bikini Bottom, Christmas night exposes the truth the day worked so hard to hide. The town looks peaceful, but it doesn't feel healed. The silence doesn't feel restful yet. It feels revealing. Loneliness becomes easier to see when there's no longer a crowd to disappear into. When you're alone, there's no performance to maintain. no smile to hold. Either the holiday created lasting warmth, or it only masked discomfort for a few hours. Both cannot be true. And Christmas night answers that question without saying a word. Whatever remains now was already there before. It just didn't have room to breathe. Squidward sits in his quiet. SpongeBob slows down in his own space. The town doesn't check in on either of them. Not because it's cruel, but because the structure doesn't include aftermath. There's no script for what comes after joy. The system assumes the feeling lingers. When it doesn't, no one knows what to do with that absence. This is where the tone becomes almost clinical, not cold but precise. Observation without judgment. The holiday passes and nothing fundamentally shifts. The same distances remain. The same misunderstandings persist. Christmas didn't make things worse. It simply didn't make them better, and that realization carries weight. You can linger here. The quiet allows it. There's no rush to move on, no expectation to react, just the hum of the town settling back into itself. This is the liminal space after meaning has been assigned and then removed. A pause, a breath, a moment where the truth is visible because nothing is covering it anymore. This is why the loneliness feels sharper now. Not because it increased, but because there's nothing distracting you from it. During the day, the noise helped you forget. At night, the silence reminds you. The contrast makes everything feel heavier. Christmas night doesn't accuse anyone. It doesn't demand reflection. It simply exists as evidence. Evidence that the celebration was temporary, and the emotional landscape underneath it stayed the same. The lights may still glow faintly, but they don't warm the room anymore. When the celebration ends, whatever remains was always there. And for Squidward, what remains is quiet, uninterrupted, and finally, uncontested. This is the point where resistance fades, not because it failed, but because it ran out of energy. Squidward is alone now, but the aloneness feels different than before. There's no sharp edge to it, no irritation pushing outward, no need to argue with the holiday or define himself against it. The fight is over not because it was won or lost, but because it no longer feels necessary. Earlier, his withdrawal carried tension. It was a response, a boundary held firmly in place. Now that boundary softens into stillness. Squidward isn't pushing back against anything anymore. He's conserving what little emotional energy he has left. This isn't surrender, it's management. The quiet becomes a way to stay intact. You can feel how tired this is. Not dramatic exhaustion, but the deep fatigue that settles in after long periods of self-defense. When you've spent too much time explaining yourself, resisting expectations, or bracing for judgment, eventually you stop reacting. Not because you don't care, but because caring takes too much out of you. Squidward's loneliness changes shape here. It's no longer sharp enough to hurt. It's dull, constant, familiar. The kind of loneliness that stops demanding attention because it's been around too long. This is the loneliness you learn to live with, the kind that becomes part of the background of your days. There's something almost compassionate about this stage. Squidward is no longer angry at the system. Anger requires energy. He's no longer hoping it will understand him either. Hope requires vulnerability. What's left is acceptance, not approval, just recognition. This is how things are. Fighting them won't make them different. You might recognize this feeling the moment you stop trying to change how others see you. The relief of letting go of expectations that were never going to be met. Emotional withdrawal isn't always a failure. Sometimes it's a form of rest, a way to survive without constantly reopening the same wound. Either Squidward continues resisting and stays exhausted, or he steps back and protects himself through distance. Both cannot happen at the same time, and quietly he chooses distance. The system remains intact, but it no longer presses directly against him. The pressure fades because he stops pushing against it. This is not a happy ending, but it is a calmer one. Squidward doesn't feel better. He feels steadier. The emotional noise drops. The disappointment dulls. The expectations lose their grip. In this stillness, he can breathe without performing, without defending, without explaining. The town doesn't notice this shift. There's nothing to notice. Squidward hasn't made a statement. He hasn't changed his behavior in a way that demands attention. That's part of the point. Emotional fatigue doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly and rearranges priorities. This is where loneliness becomes manageable. Not solved, not healed, just easier to carry. When you stop expecting connection from places that have consistently failed to offer it, the disappointment lessens. The isolation remains, but it no longer surprises you. Familiar pain hurts less than unpredictable hope. Squidward sits with this familiarity now. The holiday has passed. The pressure has eased. What's left is a version of himself that isn't trying to be understood. He's simply existing within his limits, and for the first time in a long while, that feels sustainable. Eventually, even resistance gets tired, and in the quiet that follows, SpongeBob feels something he doesn't quite have a name for yet. When no one is watching, SpongeBob slows down. Not abruptly, not in a way that draws attention, just enough that the constant bounce softens into something heavier. The smile is still there, but it lingers a second longer than usual, like it's waiting for instructions that never arrive. This is not despair. It's disappointment settling in gently without making a scene. All day, SpongeBob believed that effort would be enough, that if he tried hard enough, cared deeply enough, showed up with enough enthusiasm, something would shift. That belief carried him through the holiday. It gave him purpose. But now the noise is gone, and the outcome is clear. Nothing changed. Squidward is still distant. The town is still the same. The joy didn't spread the way it was supposed to. This realization doesn't hit like a shock. It unfolds slowly. SpongeBob replays the day in his mind, not critically, but quietly. The songs, the decorations, the gestures. He did everything right. And that's what makes the disappointment feel so strange. There's no mistake to correct, no obvious fix, just the uncomfortable truth that effort does not guarantee connection. You know this feeling, the one that shows up after you've done everything you could, and the result still isn't there. When you've been patient, supportive, positive, and it still wasn't enough. It doesn't feel like failure. It feels like gravity, something unavoidable, something no amount of optimism can override. SpongeBob's sadness doesn't look like giving up. It looks like still trying, just more slowly. The cheer dims, not because he's angry, but because it's tired. His optimism doesn't disappear. It thins. It stretches over uncertainty. He's still smiling, but the smile doesn't carry him forward the way it used to. This is the quiet cost of emotional labor. When your identity is built around helping others feel better, their inability to do so feels personal, even when it isn't. SpongeBob isn't being rejected. He's encountering a limit, and limits are hard to accept when you've spent your life believing that care can overcome anything. Either effort always leads to connection, or some connections aren't created through effort alone. Both cannot be true. And SpongeBob stands in that contradiction, unsure which version of the world he's living in now. Accepting the second means redefining himself. It means letting go of the idea that he can fix everything by being kind enough. This isn't a dramatic reckoning. It's a soft one. SpongeBob doesn't sit down and cry. He doesn't lash out. He just pauses. He looks around his quiet space. The decorations feel less important now. The silence feels heavier, but also more honest. For the first time, he allows himself to notice that trying so hard has been exhausting. There's no blame here, not for Squidward, not for the town, not even for SpongeBob. This disappointment isn't caused by anyone doing something wrong. It's caused by the simple reality that human connection doesn't always respond to effort the way we want it to. Sometimes, no matter how much you give, the distance remains. This is where burnout begins, quietly. Not with anger, but with doubt. The question of whether continuing to try will lead anywhere different next time. SpongeBob doesn't answer that question yet. He just holds it, lets it exist. That alone is a change. For viewers who have spent years being the emotional glue, this moment lands softly but deeply. The recognition that caring isn't a guarantee, that optimism has limits, and that reaching those limits doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. SpongeBob sits with that realization now, still smiling but more slowly, more carefully, as if learning how to carry joy without expecting it to solve everything. Trying your best doesn't always change the outcome, and once that truth settles in, the town does what it has always done best. It resets. Bikini Bottom returns to neutral with remarkable efficiency. Decorations come down without ceremony. Lights are unplugged. Wreaths disappear. The sand looks ordinary again. There's no discussion about how the holiday felt or whether it worked. There's no debrief, no reflection. The celebration ends, and the system immediately shifts back into routine, as if nothing unusual ever happened. This return to normal is quiet, almost soothing, familiar. The town knows how to do this part. Roles snap back into place. People go back to work. Conversations return to their default topics. The emotional intensity of Christmas dissolves into background noise. Whatever tension existed is not resolved. It's simply abandoned. This is how the absence of closure becomes the closure. Nothing is addressed, so nothing has to change. The town doesn't ask what the holiday revealed. It doesn't check whether anyone felt left out or overwhelmed. It assumes the transition back to routine is enough. That normalcy itself is the reward. You've seen this happen in real life. The way workplaces move on after stressful periods without acknowledging the toll. The way families pack up decorations and never talk about the awkward moments that lingered. The relief of returning to routine mixed with the quiet knowledge that something important was skipped over. Bikini Bottom treats emotional neutrality as success. Once the heightened expectations of Christmas are gone, the town relaxes. Neutral feels safe. Neutral feels manageable. There's no pressure to be joyful anymore, but there's also no space to be honest about what the joy cost. The system breathes a sigh of relief and keeps going. Either the holiday required reflection, or it was never meant to change anything in the first place. Both cannot be true. And the town's behavior answers that question without words. Christmas wasn't designed to transform anyone. It was designed to run, to look right, and then to end cleanly. Squidward's isolation remains unchanged, but less visible now that the spotlight is gone. SpongeBob's quiet disappointment blends into routine. The town doesn't notice either of these things, because noticing would slow things down. It would require care, and care in this system is optional once the performance is over. There's something deeply comforting about this reset. The predictability, the way everything returns to its usual shape. For people who are tired, routine feels like rest. It offers structure without asking questions. That's why the town embraces it so quickly. It's easier to forget than to understand. But forgetting isn't healing. It's postponement. The same emotional patterns remain in place, ready to repeat next year. The same roles, the same expectations, the same quiet exclusions. Nothing has been fixed, but nothing feels urgent enough to address either. That's how systems endure. The town doesn't reflect, because reflection would introduce uncertainty. It would force people to admit that the holiday didn't work for everyone. The joy isn't evenly distributed. That effort doesn't guarantee connection. Those truths complicate the narrative, so they're left unspoken. Instead, the town returns to neutral, to baseline, to a familiar emotional temperature that feels easier to manage. The celebration fades into memory. The discomfort fades into background noise. Life continues. This neutrality isn't cruel. It's efficient, and that efficiency is exactly what allows emotional neglect to persist without confrontation. No one is blamed. No one is helped. Everything simply continues. The system didn't fail. It simply moved on. And that movement reveals something deeper about how the holiday really functions. Christmas in Bikini Bottom is not an event. It's a closed circuit. It begins, it runs its course, and it ends in exactly the same place every year. Nothing carries over. Nothing accumulates. Whatever discomfort surfaced gets folded back into routine and stored away until the next cycle begins. The town doesn't remember the details. It only remembers the shape. This Christmas connects seamlessly to the one before it and quietly prepares the ground for the one that will come next. The expectations stay the same. The roles remain intact. The pressure to perform joy returns on schedule. The system resets so completely that it feels new every time, even though nothing about it has changed. You can feel how familiar this is. The holiday that arrives with the same promises, triggers the same stress, and ends with the same emotional drop. Each year feels isolated when you're inside it, but when you step back, the pattern becomes obvious. The loneliness doesn't spike randomly. It follows a schedule. It moves in a loop. Squidward's isolation persists, not because he fails to escape it, but because the structure never allows for escape. SpongeBob's optimism recharges just enough to try again next time. The town prepares itself to repeat the process without reflection. This isn't stagnation, it's design. Closed circuits are efficient because they don't leak. Nothing has to be processed. Nothing has to be resolved. Either the holiday evolves through experience, or it repeats itself without learning. Both cannot happen at the same time, and Bikini Bottom chooses repetition, not out of malice, but out of familiarity. Familiar patterns require less energy. They let everyone move on without carrying the emotional weight of the past. This repetition has a calming quality to it. There's comfort in knowing what comes next, even if what comes next isn't fulfilling. Predictable disappointment feels safer than unpredictable hope. That's why the circuit stays closed. It protects the system from change, and it protects the people inside it from uncertainty. The town doesn't question why certain characters always end up in the same emotional positions. It accepts it as natural. Squidward is always distant. SpongeBob is always trying. Others move in and out of the center without ever disrupting the flow. The repetition becomes a kind of lullaby, familiar enough to stop thinking about. You might notice how this eases tension. Once you recognize the loop, you stop waiting for a breakthrough. You stop anticipating resolution. The story isn't building toward a fix. It's circling around acceptance. This doesn't mean giving up. It means letting go of the expectation that this time will be different. There's relief in that. When you stop expecting the holiday to heal anything, its failure to do so hurts less. You adjust your emotional investment. You participate just enough. You protect your energy. This is how people learn to survive inside closed systems, not by breaking them, but by adapting to their rhythm. The holiday comes and goes. The town resets. The same feelings resurface next year with a slightly different coat of paint. And because it's familiar, it doesn't shock anyone anymore. Familiar pain blends into background noise. Familiar loneliness feels manageable. This is where the narrative gently loosens its grip. There's no need to solve the loop. No need to escape it tonight. Recognizing it is enough. Letting it be what it is allows the tension to soften. The circuit continues, but you don't have to fight it. You can simply notice it. And as the idea settles in, the repetition becomes less demanding. The analysis fades. The need for answers quiets down. The story doesn't push forward anymore. It rests inside its own familiarity. And next year, it will feel familiar again, which is exactly why you don't have to understand it right now. This is where the story slows down on purpose, not because there's nothing left to say, but because nothing needs to be solved anymore. The patterns have been traced, the loop has been seen, and once something is seen clearly enough, the pressure to fix it can finally loosen. You don't need to untangle every emotional thread. You don't need to decide who was right or wrong. You don't need to diagnose the system or repair it in your head. Tonight isn't asking for that kind of effort. Understanding can rest. Analysis can fade. The story has done its work already. There's a quiet relief in allowing things to remain incomplete. The need to explain everything is heavy. It keeps your mind active when your body wants to rest. So here, the language softens. Ideas repeat more gently, not to convince you of anything, but to reassure you that it's safe to stop reaching for conclusions. Bikini Bottom doesn't suddenly make sense here, and it doesn't have to. Squidward doesn't find closure. SpongeBob doesn't find an answer. The town doesn't learn a lesson. That absence of resolution is not a failure. It's an invitation to let go of the expectation that every story must end with clarity. You're allowed to sit inside uncertainty without fixing it. You're allowed to acknowledge that some emotional systems are simply the way they are. This doesn't mean you approve of them. It just means you don't have to carry them tonight. Understanding can be optional. Rest doesn't require answers. You've spent enough time being alert, enough time reading between lines, enough time recognizing patterns in your own life and seeing how familiar they are here. That recognition is enough. You don't need to push it any further. The mind can soften its grip. This is the point where repetition becomes comfort instead of analysis. The same ideas return, but quieter now. Joy was visible. Loneliness was invisible. The holiday passed. The system reset. The loop continued. You already know this. You don't need to hold it tightly anymore. There's something calming about admitting that not everything is meant to be resolved in one sitting. Some things are meant to be noticed and then set down, like a thought you acknowledge and let drift away, like a memory that doesn't need to be replayed tonight. If you feel your attention slipping, that's okay. That's the intention. The story doesn't need your full focus anymore. It can carry itself. You don't have to stay alert to follow it. You can let it run in the background, like a familiar show playing softly from another room. This is where safety settles in. Nothing is about to happen. No sudden shift. No demand for insight. Just the steady sense that you're allowed to pause, that you're allowed to not know, that you're allowed to rest without earning it. You don't have to figure out what any of this means for you personally. You don't have to map it onto your own life right now. Those connections can wait. Tonight isn't for processing, it's for easing off. The holiday story can fade into something less sharp, less demanding. It can become background noise, like distant lights dimming one by one. You don't need to follow them as they go out. You can simply notice that the room is getting quieter. And in that quiet, there's no expectation left, no role to play, no emotion to perform, just the permission to be still. You don't have to figure it out tonight, and you don't have to carry it alone either, because the feeling that lingered through this story was never just one character's burden. Loneliness in Bikini Bottom isn't isolated to Squidward. It doesn't belong only to SpongeBob. It moves quietly through the town like background noise, present even when no one names it. It sits in rooms filled with people. It hums beneath conversations. It exists alongside routine, laughter, and movement. This kind of loneliness isn't dramatic. It's ambient. And because it's ambient, it often goes unnoticed. When you look closely, everyone is carrying a version of it. Some carry it loudly, through frustration or withdrawal. Others carry it softly, through constant effort and optimism. Some don't even realize they're carrying it at all. But it's there, shared, circulating, part of the environment, rather than a personal flaw. This reframing matters because loneliness feels heavier when you believe it's unique to you, when you assume it's the result of something you did wrong, something you failed to fix. But here, the story widens its lens. The isolation wasn't created by one person's behavior. It emerged from a system that doesn't slow down long enough to notice anyone fully. You've felt this kind of loneliness before, sitting in a familiar place, surrounded by familiar people, and still feeling slightly out of sync, not disconnected enough to leave, but not connected enough to feel held. The feeling isn't a sign of personal failure. It's a common human experience, especially in environments that prioritize function over feeling. Loneliness becomes easier to live with when you stop treating it like an accusation. When you recognize that it often shows up not because you are lacking, but because the structures around you are limited. They aren't built to hold everything you feel. That doesn't make you wrong. It makes the experience shared. Either loneliness is proof that something is wrong with you, or it's a natural byproduct of moving through systems that weren't designed for deep connection. Both cannot be true. And the second option offers relief. It allows the feeling to soften, to exist without demanding explanation or correction. In Bikini Bottom, everyone moves through their day slightly buffered from one another, close enough to interact, far enough to stay separate, That distance isn't malicious, it's habitual. Over time, it becomes normal, and because it's normal, it becomes invisible. Until moments like this, when everything slows down and you can finally sense it. The tone here stays gentle, because this realization isn't meant to disturb you. It's meant to reassure you. You aren't alone in feeling alone. Even the people who seem surrounded, cheerful, or busy carry quiet gaps inside them. Those gaps don't mean something is missing in you. They mean connection is imperfect everywhere. This is why the loneliness in the story doesn't feel threatening anymore. Once it's shared, it loses its edge. It becomes something you can acknowledge without panic, something you can sit beside instead of trying to outrun. The fear dissolves when the isolation stops feeling personal. You don't need to fix this feeling tonight. You don't need to assign blame or trace its origin. You can simply recognize it as part of being human, something that comes and goes, something that doesn't define you. As the story widens, the pressure narrows. The loneliness no longer belongs to one character. It belongs to the space between them. And because it's shared, it's lighter, easier to hold, easier to release. Even when it feels personal, it rarely is. And as that understanding settles, the loop doesn't disappear. It softens. The ideas you've been holding begin to slow down. Joy, silence, winter, routine. They return, but not as arguments anymore. They arrive like familiar sounds, the kind you don't analyze, the kind you let exist in the background. The town of Bikini Bottom hums quietly now, no longer asking to be understood. Joy is still there, but it's quieter. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to prove anything. It simply passes through like a light left on in another room. Silence follows it, not as something empty, but as something wide and calm. Winter settles in, steady and unchanging. Routine continues, gentle and predictable. The loop is still moving, but it no longer demands attention. Earlier, you traced it, you named it, you watched how it worked. Now, you don't have to do that anymore. The repetition becomes rhythm, familiar enough to rest inside. The analysis loosens its grip and turns into cadence. Bikini Bottom wakes up, Bikini Bottom works, Bikini Bottom rests. Decorations come and go, feelings rise and fall. Nothing sharp happens here, nothing urgent. The town continues the way it always has, and that continuation becomes soothing instead of unsettling. You don't need to follow every step anymore. The story doesn't require your focus. It can play softly, like a rerun from the VHS era, something you've seen before, something you don't need to watch closely to know how it feels. The shapes are familiar, the movement is slow, the tone stays even. Joy drifts in, silence drifts out. Then they switch places. Winter holds everything still for a moment. Routine carries it forward again. The loop breathes in and out. No pressure, no demand to intervene. Just the steady sense that things are moving at their own pace. This is where thinking becomes optional. You can let the words wash over you instead of through you. There's nothing hidden here anymore. No trap to avoid. No conclusion to reach. The loop isn't something to solve. It's something to settle into. The town hums the same way your mind does when it starts to slow. Thoughts repeat, but they lose their sharp edges. The same ideas pass by again and again, but each time they feel lighter, less important, easier to release. Joy doesn't need to be defined now. Silence doesn't need to be filled. Winter doesn't need to end. Routine doesn't need to change. Everything is allowed to be exactly what it is, without explanation. That permission is what softens the loop. You may notice your attention drifting. That's fine. The story isn't asking you to stay alert. It isn't building toward anything dramatic. It's simply continuing, the way familiar things do when you stop watching them closely. The town keeps moving, even when no one is paying attention. The patterns repeat without effort. The cycle carries itself. You don't have to push it forward. You don't have to hold it together. It exists on its own. This is where the narrative becomes less like a thought and more like a sound, present, steady, unobtrusive, something you can fall asleep to without missing anything important, because nothing important is happening now, just continuation. The loop is still there, gentle and unbroken. It doesn't need you anymore. It doesn't ask for interpretation. It simply goes on, calm and consistent, like background noise you trust enough to ignore. It keeps going, even when you stop thinking about it, and somewhere inside that quiet motion, Christmas begins to change shape. Imagine a version of the holiday that doesn't ask anything of you. No smiling on cue, no participating correctly, no proving that you feel the right way at the right time. Christmas exists here only as scenery, lights without instruction, music without expectation, a season that passes through the room without checking whether you noticed it. In this version, nothing is required. You don't have to decorate. You don't have to react. You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. The holiday doesn't measure you. It doesn't watch you. It doesn't wait for your approval. It simply exists, like weather outside a window, present but not demanding. This is different from rejection. You're not opting out. You're being released. Released from the idea that holidays need effort to be valid. Released from the pressure to match a mood that never fully belonged to you. Christmas becomes something you can look at instead of something you have to step into. You might notice how your body responds to that thought. The shoulders drop a little. The jaw loosens. There's no timeline to follow. No emotional performance to maintain. The season doesn't need anything from you to continue. It doesn't collapse if you rest. Bikini Bottom feels different here. The lights are softer. The sounds are farther away. The town still exists, but it isn't asking for participation. Characters move quietly through their spaces, not celebrating, not resisting, just existing. There's no wrong way to be in this version of the holiday. Either Christmas requires emotional output, or it can exist without demand. Both cannot be true. And in this softened version, demand fades away. What remains is something calmer, something easier to sit beside. You don't have to decide how you feel about it. You don't have to label the experience. Joy can pass through without stopping. Loneliness can sit quietly without being interrogated. Nothing here needs fixing. Nothing needs to be solved. This is where the holiday stops feeling heavy, when it no longer asks for proof, when it no longer insists on participation. It becomes background, a gentle presence, something that doesn't mind if you're quiet. You might remember moments like this, late at night, after everything has ended, when the lights are still on, but the pressure is gone, when the season feels distant enough to be safe. That's the feeling this version of Christmas holds on to. There's no judgment here, not for being tired, not for feeling numb, not for wanting distance. The holiday doesn't care how you engage with it. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't take notes. It simply passes through time, whether you follow it or not. This is why the tone becomes softer, almost like a lullaby. The words slow down because there's nothing left to chase. You don't need to keep up. You don't need to stay alert. You can let the season exist without carrying it. Christmas without demand feels lighter, not because it's happier, but because it's quieter. It doesn't pull at you. It doesn't ask you to be anything other than present, if you want to be present at all. You can just be here, sitting inside the moment without expectation, letting the holiday drift by like background light. Nothing required, nothing owed, no role to play. You're allowed to just be here, and as you stay there, the season begins to loosen its grip on you. Nothing ends sharply. There is no final moment. The holiday doesn't shut off. It drifts. Sounds soften first. The faint echo of music you didn't realize was still playing fades into the background. The lights feel dimmer, not because they turned off, but because you're no longer focused on them. Your attention pulls inward, away from the decorations, away from the expectations, away from the story that has already finished saying what it needed to say. Bikini Bottom keeps going without you watching it. The town doesn't pause. It doesn't wait for acknowledgement. Characters move quietly through familiar routines. Doors close, rooms settle. Nothing important is happening now, and that is what makes it safe. The system continues on its own, finally free from your analysis. Your thoughts begin to slow in the same way. They don't stop all at once. They repeat, but more softly. Joy, silence, winter, routine. The words feel lighter each time they pass through. They no longer need to connect to anything. They don't need meaning. They can exist as sound, as rhythm, as something you don't have to follow. There's a deep comfort in realizing that nothing is required anymore. You don't need to hold on to the story. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to carry the emotional weight of it forward. The holiday can fade without resolution, and that's okay. Not everything needs to be wrapped up cleanly to be set down. You might feel your body responding before your mind does. Breathing slows, muscles soften. The tension that built up through the season finally finds somewhere to go. There's no urgency left, no expectation to react, no pressure to feel a certain way. Either you stay alert and keep thinking, or you allow the thoughts to drift and loosen. Both cannot happen at the same time. And here, gently, without forcing it, the second option becomes easier. Thinking takes effort. Letting go does not. Bikini Bottom becomes distant now, not gone, just far away enough that it doesn't ask anything of you. Like a familiar place you know will still be there tomorrow. You don't need to check on it. You don't need to worry about it. It's stable, predictable, quiet. The repetition turns into a kind of mantra. The town continues. The season passes. The lights fade. The loop hums softly. Each phrase feels less important than the last. The meaning dissolves into calm. This is the part where the story stops being something you listen to and becomes something that carries you. If your mind wanders, let it. If your attention slips, that's fine. Nothing here needs your focus anymore. The narrative has reached its resting place. You don't have to stay awake to keep it going. There's a sense of permission in this moment. Permission to stop processing. Permission to stop reflecting. Permission to stop holding on to anything at all. The holiday doesn't need you. The story doesn't need you. You can rest without missing anything. The sounds grow quieter. The images blur. The season drifts further into the background until it's no longer a season at all. Just a distant warmth you don't have to name. The town exists. You exist. That's enough. And now, you don't have to think about it anymore. If you enjoyed our video, subscribe to SpongeBob Sleep Stories for more videos like these.